The time you think you have doesn't exist. We live as if tomorrow were guaranteed, as if we had decades ahead of us to do what really matters. But what if I told you that the only certainty in your life is that time is running out? Now, stop for a second. Think about it. What if you knew you had exactly 1 year to live? What would you change? Would you quit that job you hate? Would you finally start that project you've been putting off for years? Or worse, would you realize that you never even knew what you really wanted out of life? Most people put off their dreams until later, believing they have plenty of time. But what happens when this illusion is shattered? What happens when someone realizes that they are running out of time? Søren Kierkegaard grew up believing that he wouldn't live past the age of 33. For him, death wasn't a distant possibility. It was a countdown. Fyodor Dostoevsky, another giant of literature, was sentenced to death, taken to the place of execution, tasted the approaching end, and then, in the last seconds, was spared. These men had a glimpse of what we avoid thinking about every day, our finitude. But instead of being crushed by fear, they turned death into fuel to live intensely and unforgettably. But what about us? Do we need to wait for a tragedy, a diagnosis, or a shock of reality to wake us up? Or can we learn this lesson before it's too late? Because the truth is this: there is no escape. Death is coming for all of us. The only question is, when it comes, will we have really lived? Imagine growing up with the absolute certainty that you won't live long. Imagine feeling that, no matter what you do, your clock is ticking faster than everyone else's. For Søren Kierkegaard, time is a curse. For Søren Kierkegaard, this wasn't an abstract thought. It was a conviction. His father, a deeply religious man, believed he had committed a sin so grave that his family was cursed. He was convinced that none of his children would live past the age of Christ, 33. And as Kierkegaard's siblings died one by one, this idea became impossible to ignore. Think about it. Most of us live believing that death is far away, that it is a concern for the future. Kierkegaard didn't have that luxury. At the age of 30, he already felt the weight of death approaching. But instead of despairing, he turned this feeling into an overwhelming force. Over the next 3 years, he wrote 16 books: philosophy, religion, existentialism. His output was intense, almost insane, as if every page he wrote was an attempt to negotiate with time, to wrest meaning from life before it slipped away. And then, he turned 34, something he never thought would happen. His diary from this period contains a disconcerting phrase: "How strange it is to have turned 34. It's totally inconceivable to me. I was sure I would die before or exactly on that birthday. I even think that my date of birth was written down wrong and that I will still die at 34. He survived. But was that a relief? Or was it a new condemnation? Because now, without the deadline that had always accompanied him, Kierkegaard had to deal with a new fear. What to do with the time he had never planned to have? This is a question that many of us face without realizing it. When we think we have plenty of time, we waste every second without guilt. But when we feel that time is running out, every moment becomes valuable. Now, think about your own life. Are you waiting for some kind of right moment to start something? Do you put off projects, conversations, decisions, because you believe there will always be tomorrow? Kierkegaard shows us that time was never ours to begin with. The great irony? He died at the young age of 42, but his impact spanned generations. He lived each year as if it were his last, and in the end, that's what made his existence continue far beyond his death. But not everyone needs to carry the certainty of a curse to feel the weight of time. Sometimes the reality of death comes much more brutally, without warning, with no time to prepare. And no one understood this better than Dostoevsky. Is this content making you reflect and sparking new ways of thinking? If so, click the super thanks button just below the video. It's a way to say thank you and help me bring more content like this to those who need to reflect on life. If you knew you only had 3 minutes to live, what would go through your mind? What would you regret? What would you regret? In 1849, Fyodor Dostoevsky had this experience for real. He was sentenced to death, and it wasn't just a distant abstract trial. He was taken to the place of execution. He put on the white robe of the condemned. He heard the sound of weapons being prepared. He looked into the empty eyes of the soldiers who would be ordered to kill him. And it was exactly there, seconds from death, that his whole life flashed before his eyes. The time he had wasted, the pointless arguments, the moments he could have lived more intensely. everything turned into absolute despair. He would have done everything differently, but now it was too late. There was no more time, or so he believed. At the last moment, when the rifles were already pointed at his chest, the shock came. The execution was cancelled. The Tsar decided to pardon him, but not without making a public spectacle of it. He wanted Dostoevsky and the other prisoners to feel the weight of death, only to be saved and sent to a forced labor camp in Siberia. The scene, planned to be a horror play, had an unexpected effect. Dostoevsky was reborn. After that day, he was never the same. He saw every moment with new eyes. He realized that life was in him, and not in the world around him. In a letter written shortly after this event, he said, "When I think of how much time has been lost, how I have wasted my life, my heart squeezes with pain. Life is a gift. Life is happiness. Every second can be an eternity of joy. If only young people knew that." Dostoevsky had the chance to rewrite his story, but this raises a disturbing question. How many people reach the end of their lives without that second chance? How often do we find ourselves wasting time on trivial concerns, believing that we'll still have years to do what really matters? But what happens if this illusion is shattered? What happens when we realize, like Dostoevsky, that the time we think we have could disappear at any moment? Dostoevsky had a brutal encounter with death, but the truth is that most of us never go through such an intense experience. We never come face to face with finitude, and perhaps that's exactly why we live as if time were infinite. Our brains have been programmed to avoid thinking about death. This mechanism has a name: terror management theory. According to this theory, when we are confronted with the idea of death, our immediate instinct is to look away. We create distractions, we sink into routine, we keep our minds occupied with whatever, anything, to avoid the discomfort of remembering that we are here for a limited time. And so time goes by, and without realizing it, we put off everything that really matters. How many times have you said to yourself, "One day I'll do it, then I'll sort it out. I still have time." But the real question is, what if you don't? Many people, when they reach the end of their lives, realize that they never took charge of their own time. They didn't make the difficult decisions. They didn't leave their comfort zone. They lived each day as if they had plenty of time, but time was never guaranteed. The Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote, "Life is not short. We make it short by wasting time on what doesn't matter." And this brings us to an interesting paradox. Even though we know that our time is limited, many people are paralyzed by this truth. The fear of death can lead not to an urgency to live, but to perfectionism and extreme procrastination. One of the most impactful comments on this subject came from someone who said, "When I think that time is limited, I become a perfectionist. It stops me from taking action, because if it's not perfect, there's no point in starting." This describes something that many people feel, even without realizing it. The fear of death doesn't drive them to live better. On the contrary, it makes them avoid acting, because if every decision matters, then making mistakes seems unacceptable. But here's the truth. Mistakes are part of life. Time will never be enough to do everything, but it will always be enough to do something. And if there's anything worse than making a mistake, it's never trying. Because, in the end, nobody regrets the mistakes they've made, but almost everyone regrets the things they never did. But even after we're gone, can a part of us live on? Some losses seem irreversible. When someone you love dies, there is absolute silence. The world moves on, the routine continues, but everything seems strangely empty. That person's laughter will never be heard again. Their voice, their opinions, their touch, everything disappears. But does it really disappear? Once, a man was organizing his house when he came across an old book. It was one of those banal everyday moments, cleaning a shelf, flipping through a few pages. But then something caught his eye. Inside the book, there were underlined passages, marked phrases, little handwritten notes. He recognized the handwriting immediately. It was his mother's, who had died years before. In that instant, time stood still. It was as if she was there, as if her words echoed from somewhere beyond time. He ran his fingers over the pages, trying to imagine what she was thinking when she read those sentences, why she chose to mark certain passages and not others. Suddenly, he realized something profound. People never disappear completely. They continue to exist in the stories they left behind, in the memories we cherish, in the little marks they imprinted on us without even realizing it. Death takes us physically, but it cannot erase what we leave in others. And that brings us to an essential question. What does it really mean to live forever? In Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel, Memorias de Niñas Putas Tristes, there's a passage that says, "Life is not what one lives, but what one remembers, and how one remembers to tell it." In the end, the story of our lives is not written by us alone. It is written in the memories of those who knew us, and that can last far beyond our time here. Kierkegaard died more than 150 years ago. So did Dostoevsky, but somehow they're still alive. We're talking about them now. Their words have crossed time, their ideas continue to echo. That's immortality. But that brings us to another disturbing thought. What are we leaving behind? Most people don't think about it. They live immersed in trivial concerns. They get irritated by small daily frustrations. They busy themselves with tasks that, in the end, won't matter at all. They live as if what they do won't echo once they're gone. But it does. Everything echoes. In Japan, there is a concept called wabi-sabi. It teaches us to accept the impermanence of life, to see the beauty in what is fleeting. Life is not beautiful despite its finitude. It is beautiful precisely because of it. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "What we do now echoes in eternity. Your actions, your words, your choices, they all leave their mark. What you teach can be passed down for generations. What you create can continue to influence people long after you are gone. What you love can inspire others to love it too." And that changes everything, because in the end, the question has never been how much time we have. It's what we do with that time. If there's one way to defy death, to continue to exist beyond it, it's this: to live so intensely and meaningfully that a part of us lives on in the people we touch. But to do this, first of all, we need to accept death. Not as an absolute end, but as an inevitable part of life. And one of the philosophers who best explained this was Martin Heidegger. Most people live as if death were a distant event, something that should only be thought about when old age arrives. They wake up, follow their routines, fill their days with tasks and distractions, believing that tomorrow is guaranteed. But what if this illusion were shattered? For philosopher Martin Heidegger, most of us live in what he called inauthentic existence, a state in which we only exist on autopilot, following social patterns and distractions, without ever really facing the reality of our own finitude. And the most interesting thing, it's not death that terrifies us. What really scares us is the fact that if we accept that death could happen at any moment, we will need to take full responsibility for how we are living now. Because if you really understood that your life has an end, that every day not lived is a day that will never come again, then you would have to stop fooling yourself. You'd have to admit that you're putting off important things, that you're spending too much time with people who don't add anything to your life, that you're occupying yourself with trivialities while the days go by without you noticing. And facing this truth is uncomfortable, so we avoid it. We prefer to pretend that we have plenty of time, but Heidegger warns us. This avoidance prevents us from living. He said that death is not just an event that happens at the end of life. It is present all the time. It is a constant possibility, and the more we avoid thinking about it, the more we waste the present. I remember one particular day when this concept hit me in a very real way. I was busy with something totally trivial, perhaps checking social media or sorting out something unimportant. Then, out of nowhere, a piece of news appeared on my screen. Someone my age had died. That shock hit me like a punch in the stomach. For a moment, the world went silent, because the question that came into my mind was brutal. What if it had been me? What would I have left behind? How would I be remembered? Did I really live my days as if they were finite? At that moment, I found myself confronted with exactly the truth that Heidegger describes. Most people live as if they were immortal, avoiding any reminder of their own mortality. But living by running away from death is the same as living by running away from life. There's a movie that illustrates this brilliantly. In Schindler's List, there is a moment when a prisoner believes he is going to be executed. Time seems to slow down. Silence sets in. In that second, his whole life comes down to a single thought. Is this my last moment? But then, suddenly, the execution doesn't happen. And it's impossible to imagine that this man simply returned to normal afterwards. Because once you look death in the eye, you never see life the same way again. Heidegger argues that this awareness shouldn't only arise at extreme moments, it should be present all the time. Because only when we accept that our time is finite can we really decide what is worthwhile and what is just noise. The question then is, If we knew we only had a year to live, would we continue living the same way? Maybe it's time to test this idea, but not as an abstract thought, but as a real challenge. The next step is to turn this awareness into something real, and for that, I want to propose an experiment. Knowing that life is finite can be a powerful idea, but it can also be just that, an idea, something we hear, reflect on for a few minutes, and then forget. But what if, for an instant, this truth became real for you? Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine yourself lying in bed on your last day of life. Your body is weaker. You can no longer run, work, build, or create. There's no more time to start anything new. All that's left now are the memories of the days you've lived and the weight of the days you've wasted. What comes to mind at that moment? Do you feel regret or gratitude? Do you feel proud of the life you've lived? Or do you realize that you've always been putting off the things that really mattered? If you had one more chance, what would you do differently? Now open your eyes. You still have time. This exercise may seem uncomfortable, but it carries enormous power. When we truly understand that our days are numbered, we begin to see what really matters. So here's the challenge. For the next 7 days, before you go to sleep, ask yourself, if today had been my last day, would I have lived as I would have liked? It sounds simple, but if taken seriously, it could change everything. Perhaps you'll realize that you've spent more time on your cell phone than with the people you love. Maybe you'll find that you've once again put off that decision you know you need to make. Or maybe you'll discover that you've had an incredible day and feel grateful for it. The point is not to create anxiety about death. It's about using this awareness to live more presently. The Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote centuries ago, "One should prepare one's mind as if one were going to die at the end of each day. He who arranges his life every day never feels a lack of time." Think about it. What if every day you lived in such a way that you didn't have to regret it at the end? That means saying "I love you" without fear. It means letting go of that excuse and finally starting what you've always wanted. It means not worrying so much about other people's opinions, because in the end, they don't matter. It means living. For real. The call to life. Throughout this video, we explore the relationship between time, death, and meaning. We talk about Kierkegaard and how the belief that he would die early made him live with urgency, about Dostoevsky, who was faced with death and, on being given a second chance, never looked at life in the same way again. We've seen how most people avoid thinking about death, believing they have infinite time, and how Heidegger teaches us that the only way to live authentically is to accept our finitude. But now the question comes back to you. What does all this change in your life? You can simply turn this video off and carry on as normal. You can keep repeating the same habits, putting off the things you know you should do. Or you can decide now that you're no longer going to waste the time you have. Because in the end, the question has never been how old you are, but how many days you've actually lived. And if there's one absolute truth, it's this: time doesn't stop. It keeps moving forward, with or without your permission. The only thing you can control is how you choose to use it. So if you could go back in time to this very moment, would it change anything in your life? If so, then the real question is, why haven't you changed yet? And remember, knowledge is the path to true freedom. Count on me and follow the White Rabbit.